Professor Henry here. Welcome to the second week of the course. This is really where things start to kick up and we'll get into our routine of assignments, especially writing intensive assignments for the semester. So what I want to do in this video is just walk you through the weekly annotated reading assignments. Some of you may already have experience doing annotations, but for others, this may be a new experience. So you can read this assignment document. I won't go through it in detail for the purpose of this video, but I just want to point your attention to some of the resources that I've linked to you to help you complete these assignments properly. So remember that this is a writing intensive course. And so the way that I would like to structure weekly writing is through these annotations, essentially these notes that you can use later on to write papers or to even think about these articles and draw from them in a later context. Key thing to remember, I will assign you 14 different readings throughout the semester, generally 2 a week, with the exception of the weeks where we have videos to watch. But you only need to complete 10 of these annotations based on the readings. All right. So the reason why I'm doing this is so that way everybody has the flexibility in case they get really busy at some point in time to miss out on a few of the annotations, right? So my advice would be try and do as many of these annotations at the beginning of the semester while you have that renewed energy and spirit. So that way, if we get to the middle of the semester and you're balancing a lot of different priorities, you can afford to not submit a couple, or maybe even when we get to the end of the semester, you can choose not to submit the final 4 because you are already all caught up. All right. So like I said before, annotation is essentially a set of notes that you can refer back to on your readings that you keep, usually organized, and they help you understand the overall purpose of a reading and then connect and identify some of the main points. So as you look through this document, that's what I'm really structuring. And so for the rest of this video, what I'll do is demonstrate how I would go about creating an annotation on one of the readings I have assigned for you this week. But please be sure to read through the rest of this document because this is where I outline what I expect out of the assignment from you, how I'll grade it, and everything. And one thing I'll point out before we move over to the demonstration is the Writing Center is an incredibly helpful resource. They would be great for helping you get started on this assignment. So you can always come to me, but I would say the better resource would be taking advantage of these free 45-minute one-on-one sessions. You could literally bring this document to them, bring the article you need to annotate, and you could have a writing session tutor work with you one-on-one to really get this assignment to where it needs to be. All right, so you can register for free. I put the link here, and I highly, highly, highly recommend that you take advantage of this resource. It's wonderful. I used to work in a writing center doing this kind of work for students, and even one session I know helped students greatly for the rest of their academic career. Alrighty, so what I have here is just this kind of sample document, this bare bone structure of how I envision this assignment. So after I finish filling this out just a little bit to give you an idea of what I'm looking for, I'll post this exact Word document in the week 2 folder so you have an outline for how to do this assignment. But what I do right here, I just put what we're reading for this week, put the course title, your name, so it's identifiable as your document. And then we can hop into the reading here. All right. So this reading is particularly long, so it'll take a minute to get through. The one thing that I suggest is use some shortcuts early on. So first try and skim, look at things like the title, the subheadings, read a little bit at the beginning, jump to the end, and all of these things will help you get an overall sense about what the article is about, and then you can go back and read through the details of the supporting points. All right, so title is How Rock and Roll Became White. And this subheading here is, and how the Rolling Stones, a band in love with black music, helped lead the way to rock's segregated future. So these are two main arguments or points that the author's already putting in the title, and that's pretty common. All right. And, other things to look out for, look at when it was written. So this was before the racial reckoning of 2020. So that to me is an important context, because we have a different way broadly in this country about talking about race that in 2022 than we did back in 2016. This was before Donald Trump was election, which really changed the way that we saw race broadly and understood it in this country. So these are the ways I want you to critically engage in a reading. Look at all of these facets, right? Because this is important context, that this was published before, the current political era and climate that we're in. All right. Pictures are great. And so this first part is an introduction, and I won't read through every single point because that's what your assignment is. But, I'll just skim through here. It's giving us this little opening about the Rolling Stones. But we haven't quite gotten to like the main argument yet. So I'm skimming through, reading just lightly, seeing that they're talking about disco and the problems with that. The author's going through this overview, talking about this history. This is still introductory material. And again, make sure you take a second to look at the pictures, the visual images. Make sure you take time if they mention a sound, right? Or if they mention something that you don't know about, such as the legendary Disco Demolition Night. Those are things worth going back and looking up in greater detail. But again, we're still skimming at this point. So here, this is a big moment in the article because this starts to look like the title. So how did rock and roll music, a genre rooted in black traditions, and many of whose earliest stars were black, come to be understood as the natural province of whites? And why did this happen during a decade generally understood to be marked by unprecedented levels of interracial aesthetic exchange, musical collaboration, and commercial crossover broadly? So this is a big point, right? And if we go down to the bottom of the article, by the time of Hendrix's death, rock and roll music had in fact become white. How did this happen and why? So in my annotation, that kind of tells me a lot about the main purpose of this article. So I may write something like, the purpose of this article is to examine how rock and roll, a black originated genre became white, right? And that aligns with the title and everything. But the purpose is to analyze this, and quite honestly, for summary or thesis, this is fine. You could put more information here, but really this is the main point that this author's trying to make. The other thing that I would do to confirm this main purpose, right, is I would scroll down to the end of the article. And just so you know, this is what any, scholar or academic does. Most of us do not read articles from start to finish. A lot of us end up just reading the beginning, reading the end, and then we go through the middle part. So that way the most important stuff sticks out to us, and the details, right, or the smaller, less important points don't attract our attention as much. All right, so again, long article, but very comprehensive. So that's why I want you guys to go through this, take your time. But let's go here. So let's look at this final paragraph. Flirtations with violence that marked the music of the Rolling Stones in this period were simply absorbed into rock ideology as affirmations of the music's own white authenticity. So that's another big point I can add to flesh out this point, this main purpose, shows how white authenticity was constructed in the rock music history canon, right? And that's an important point because it's not that rock music was seen as white from the start. It grew to that, right? It grew to this idea of this once black genre now being dominated or by whiteness, right? We think of rock artists as white artists a lot of the time, white male rockers. All right. So hopefully that just gives you an example of how you can get a general idea or summary of an article here. So let's move on to picking out 5 to 8 important points. So let's find some points in the article, and I'll just do a couple, that support this main idea or that interests you. So I'll just scroll up here. So let's see here. So this is an important point. So the article is focusing on the Rolling Stones, right? And how they represent this kind of controversial changeover from black rock and roll to white rock and roll. But this is an interesting point because it adds a little bit of nuance to the argument here. So I'm going to copy and paste this quote directly, all right? And I'll make sure to indicate that it's a quote by adding the quotes here. And then, you can size this so it's not awkward formatting. Try and keep the formatting consistent. But let's read it out. This says, the Rolling Stones, particularly early on, were many things: controversial, musically erratic, image obsessed, but they did not avoid the topic of race or its salience to their own commercial success, right? So let's think, why do I find this important? I think this point is important because it shows that the band was not colorblind to issues of race that their musical performance and success I think this point is important because it shows that the band was not colorblind to issues of race and how that impacted their success and performances as rock and roll musicians. I think this is important in particular because it shows that these artists were race conscious at the time, especially during a period when the civil rights movement was occurring. So that's just an example of not only picking out what you find to be important or interesting points, but also going into explanation of specifically why these points really stuck out to you, why you think they're significant, how they contribute to or even contradict the main purpose of the article, the main arguments of that too, right? We could look for another one. This is another point. So look at this. Crucial to the ascendant mythology of the Rolling Stones throughout the 1960s was the band's purported connection to blackness and racial transgression, both in a musical sense and a more vague, imaginative one. So again, this one came a little bit earlier than the other point. But this is an important point because the author is essentially saying, one of the reasons why this band that is historic, that is iconic in this rock music history is successful is because of its connection to blackness, even though they're white artists. So, I could end up typing up a little reflection or explanation. But essentially, if you quote something like this, you want to make sure to then explain, right? Why do you think this is important? How can you perhaps use this information moving on? All right. So again, you could say, I think this is important because blah, 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 right? And then you could even connect it to later on points. Alrighty. So let me fix this formatting. So, one thing, try and make your formatting consistent, because you can always draw on these articles and these notes later on. So the more consistent you make all of these notes, it of course makes it easier for me, your instructor, to read. But when you want to draw back from these particular documents, it's really great. Alrighty. And then I would do something like, maybe bold these particular quotes here to demonstrate these points. The one thing I'll say is make sure if you're quoting something like this, try not to let it go over 25 words. Like 33 is okay, but don't quote like a whole paragraph and be like, this is my annotation. Like, don't do that. If you think the whole paragraph is important, then paraphrase. Break down the quote into maybe a couple subquotes and then comment on each point, but don't copy and paste an entire paragraph. Alrighty? Cool. And so personal reflection. So this is a point where I really want you to think about how this connects to your prior knowledge, maybe your personal experience as a music maker or a fan of music, your experience in your own industry. So you could think a little bit about, I found it fascinating, perhaps, that this complex, or I find it fascinating that this complex history is rarely covered in rock music textbooks or movies, let's say. And then you can make this more personal, right? I've personally read several books about the history of rock and have visited the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and have seen this overwhelming whiteness, right? You may also make a connection to something else that we read either early on the semester or the other readings. So you may end up saying, let's see, this article reminds me of the other article we read, which analyzed Elvis as a kind of artist that benefited from blackness, from his perceived blackness without actually being black, right? So hopefully that just gives you a little insight, and then, just make sure you cite the source. So I'll leave the citation style up to you. I use Chicago, but you may use APA, MLA, but just have some sort of consistent formatting. So I put the author's last name first, then the first name, how rock and roll became white, right? And then this is an online resource, so this is by Slate, the publication. I'll put don't want that there, the link, right, to that particular publication, and then I'll mention that I accessed it on January 31, 2022. And that's traditionally how you would do a citation in the Chicago style at least. Again, I'll leave it up to you. So, refer to whatever formatting guideline that you normally do. All right. And then I'll do hanging line. Cool. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to complete these annotations. A little bit of a long video, but I just want to make sure you guys feel comfortable doing this kind of work here. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, but otherwise I would also recommend going to the writing sample. And so right after I stop this video, I will upload this exact example document so that way you have that for your reference. And feel free to, you can use this as a format. Just delete whatever I wrote here and put your own points there. All right, have a good night or have a good week. See you guys soon.